Last week's main character has finally spoken out for the first time since getting another chance in F1 courtesy of Red Bull and AlphaTauri. After only 10 races, we're saying goodbye to Nyck de Vries. His poor performances have resulted in his contract getting terminated. This resulted in Red Bull loaning out their third driver Daniel Ricciardo to the squad based in Faenza, the squad where it all started for Ricciardo. So what is Ricciardo's plan? Why take a seat you didn't want in the first place? What is there to win? We'll fill you in on all Ricciardo had to say about his motive to return to the grid. Daniel Ricciardo has finally described his response to Red Bull Motorsport advisor Helmut Marko's phone call, offering him a comeback to Formula 1 with AlphaTauri. The Australian had been sacked by McLaren at the end of a disastrous 2-year career with the Woking-based team. Red Bull instead approached Ricciardo to be their third driver for the season, emphasizing on marketing opportunities like as showruns. However, simulator work had intensified in recent weeks, and a performance at the Pirelli tyre test following the British Grand Prix was enough to demonstrate his preparedness for a return to F1. As Nyck de Vries' problems continued, the trigger was pulled on his 10-race tenure with AlphaTauri, paving the way for Ricciardo's return to the sport. Ricciardo recalled his reaction when he saw Marko make the call. I was like, okay, let's just hear what he has to say. That's probably the best thing because sometimes you try to prepare yourself for, what if he asked me this? I didn't really need to think much about it. Being back in this family, I feel like I'm kind of going through it all again. These are the calls I used to get, and these are the moments they used to throw in front of us. There was no question I was going to say yes. It was just the reality of, okay, it's going to happen pretty soon. And it happened really soon for Ricciardo. This obviously called for an emergency interview with F1, and based on the impression he gave in his first interview since his return to the grid was announced, Daniel Ricciardo will be in great shape for the Hungarian Grand Prix, if restoring his enthusiasm for Formula 1 and his self-belief was all he needed to get over his McLaren struggles and impress on his comeback with AlphaTauri. But he's also aware of what he's up against as he replaces Nyck de Vries in one of the grid's least fortunate cars, as well as how this may be a path to the greatest car on the grid. After leaving McLaren, Ricciardo turned down opportunities to stay on the F1 grid with midfield teams because the punishing experience of 2 years mostly struggling alongside Lando Norris left him desperate for a break from F1 to try to fully comprehend what went wrong and whether he even wanted to be a part of the championship anymore. While he stated that simply taking a break after 17 years of being full-on since joining the European junior racing scene has done him a world of good, returning to the organisation that guided his early career and first brought him into F1 has clearly proven to be the ideal choice for ensuring that mental boost. He's always been honest and professional in his media appearances, at both the worst and best times of his career, but the combination of enthusiasm and serenity with which he reflected on the last 12 months and what's ahead in the F1 video gave the impression he's in a much better mental place than prior to his return to Red Bull. Falling out of a bit of love with it was that I took a bit of a hit to my confidence, Ricciardo said of his feelings about F1 at the end of 2022. And of course, if you're competing in a sport where you're trying to be the best in the world at something, you obviously need full confidence, full belief, all of it. And when that starts to diminish a little bit, the enjoyment starts to drop as well. There were just a lot of factors. And then getting back to Red Bull, and just kind of the reception I had walking back into the team was, in a positive way, a little bit overwhelming. And then getting back on the sim, I was still a bit unsure how it was going to go, if the car would feel like it used to, and if I was going to be, for the lack of a better words, like the old me. Once I'd done a few sim sessions and started to feel like myself again, it then just brought me back to normal Daniel, where I was falling back in love and ready to go again. He described how, after attending the Super Bowl in February, the sheer atmosphere of being at a high-level sport event reminded him of what had made him love his own career, and that for the first few F1 races he attended as Red Bull reserve, he was still trying to figure out the has that fire slowly burned away element of his own competitiveness and motivation. I gave myself the time, figured it all out, and then it's like you wake up one day, it's that feeling where you're like, okay, it's go time, he said. And that was the mentality after a couple of months off. Okay, it's time to build this thing back up. Throughout the conversation, Ricciardo suggested repeatedly that what he'd learned during his 6 months off had been quite valuable, and that part of it had included reviewing some of his previous blunders. What he didn't say was if he was talking about an attitude or philosophy, or variables connected to driving style. having never consistently mastered what it takes to make the McLarens of 2021 and 2022 run fast, due to two very different technical requirements. And the McLaren was a difficult car, but what about the current AlphaTauri? That car seems to be as much trouble as the McLarens Ricciardo drove were. And the 2023 AlphaTauri's major video, as we said in videos earlier this year, has been rear-end instability in the late entry phase for slower corners, which subsequently translates to understeer in the center of the curve. This may not be an inspiring mix. There were reports that Red Bull was shocked by how influenced Ricciardo's driving was by his McLaren experience when he returned to the simulator. Although reports that he was spectacularly quick in his Red Bull tyre test this week, on the day his comeback was announced, should be taken with a grain of salt, given how unrepresentative the Pirelli-controlled setup parameters and tyre compounds will have been at such a test. The fact that the Red Bull organization is willing to put him back in one of its F1 cars suggests it is confident he's driving well again. But will it be well enough? The F1 car in which he will compete is not very impressive. Ricciardo's current aim is that the AlphaTauri is sluggish but benign, with few troublesome characteristics. But will it be a car Ricciardo will be able to score points in, or at least defeat his teammate? The car will be what it is. I'm going to drive it and then work from there, said Ricciardo. I don't want to get too many preconceived ideas. I appreciate the car's going to have its limitations. I imagine they're just lacking some overall downforce, but I think if it's a car that feels balanced, it might not have as much grip as the Red Bull I drove a few days ago. But if it feels relatively balanced, then that's something I can work with, and I'm looking forward to also developing it and using my experience. But for Budapest, just go out and have fun. Just more right foot than left and have a good time. But why return to the grid now? What is Ricciardo's bigger plan? Well, Ricciardo's return with AlphaTauri comes amid a string of problems for Sergio Perez, who has watched his dominant Red Bull teammate surge away unchallenged in the championship, after hinting with victories in Saudi Arabia and Azerbaijan that he really might challenge Max Verstappen for the title, while even making Q3 has repeatedly been beyond Perez. In his talk with Ricciardo, F1 interviewer Barretto treaded cautiously with how to present the possibility of replacing Perez at Red Bull Racing, but stating that Red Bull had thrown the ball in his court in terms of where this would finally go. Ricciardo made several references in the interview to his mid-season return, and getting the call about it from Red Bull Motorsport advisor Helmut Marko, recalling how he felt as he rose through Red Bull's pecking order from Formula BMW seats to winning Grand Prix with Red Bull Racing back in 2014. And when questioned about the next step above AlphaTauri, he brought it back to that emotion. That's why it feels a bit like back when I was working my way up through in the Red Bull family, and that was it. If you get results, then we'll keep pushing you. We'll keep pushing you. So that's really the mindset, he replied initially. But he didn't say anything about where he may be pushed up to next if this went well, instead returning the topic to AlphaTauri. I know it's been tough for the team to get a points finish this year, so to push this car and try to get it inside the top 10, that would get everyone pretty fulfilled and excited, he concluded. He'd earlier joked that Red Bull had told him the expectation was just be a legend really, before suggesting that it was a more nebulous but pragmatic desire for him to just impress within the limitations of his new car. They expect results, performances. It's hard to define. Until I get in the car, it's hard to define what that is. Is it a P8? Is it a P14? Ricciardo explained. I don't think there's pressure until the summer break. There's 2 races, so I don't think there's a you have to do this before August. But I also don't expect to get off to a slow start. I want to hit the ground running and also use what I've learned in this time off. What are your expectations? Will Ricciardo hit the ground running? Will we see Ricciardo returning to Red Bull in 2024? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below.